قول له على الاي سي كام متر.
room, they can go into the far room and play to their heart's content. So the sisters can come into the adjacent room, and any of the kids who are playing can go into the sisters' area.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, just play here and then it's gonna show.
And I can flip the slides like that. Okay.
Yeah, I think this is good. Don't make it darker. Yeah, get started.
We'll get started in just 1 second.
1 second.
Are we good? In the past weeks, the Qur'an was not quite like that, so... Yeah, no, this is what we did in the past weeks. It just, do you know how to straighten out the projector?
It should offer.
Give me 1 second. إن شاء الله أنت راح تضلك واقفة بوجهي طول الوقت.
ايوه
Okay, we're good. It'll get set up in a second. Come on. There we go. Oh, okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Last week, we ended off with the end of the Great Revolt that lasted from 1936 to 1939. And as I mentioned to the attendees who were here last week, I'm actually not going to be speaking about the Nakba. I'm not going to be speaking about the War of 1948. I'm not going to be speaking about the expulsion of the Palestinians, 750,000 Palestinians, or the destruction of 500 villages. And I mentioned the reasons why last week, but for those who are not here, there is a lot that you can research on your own. There are great documentaries out there already in English, in Arabic, and other languages that already deal with the topic in a good level of detail, especially for somebody who's not a researcher and is just trying to get a general idea. So what I'm skipping to this week is actually the situation after the Nakba. So that is the period between 1948 and 1987. And here, I've tried to keep this story, based on the feedback that I've gotten from you, I've tried to keep this story as simple as possible. I've been told over the last few weeks that a lot of the names, a lot of the dates, it can get confusing, and so I've tried to keep this as simple as possible to ensure that everyone can get the most out of this lecture series. And the first thing that I want to mention right off the bat is that after 1948, at least in the way that I will be telling this story, the story of Palestinian resistance actually fractures into two distinct stories. So I'll be telling part one today, and I will be telling part two next Friday, inshallah. And this part of the story is what I call international Palestine. It is the point in the Palestinian resistance where the activities of resistance begin to expand beyond Palestine's historic borders. But in order for you to understand any of this, good? In order for you to understand any of this, in order for you to understand any of what I am about to say, you need to get a brief introduction into the world that emerged immediately after the Nakba. For the last 2 weeks, I was speaking about either Ottoman Palestine or Palestine under the British Mandate. And in both the Ottoman era of Palestine, as well as the Mandate era of Palestine, the Palestinian notables, the Ashraf, the A'yan, played a substantial role in Palestinian society. And with the Nakba, the notables were no more. That does not mean that those biological families were erased. When I say that the notables were no more, I mean that all of their power and influence and prestige was gone. Well, before I do anything else, last time I had a mic hooked up that was going to the recording. Not needed? We're good? Okay. The power and the prestige and the influence of the notables in the world after the Nakba ceased to exist. And I'll just stop here for a moment to explain what it is that I'm talking about. The notables were these families that were major land-owning families that had the political power inside of Arab Palestine. And they were the ones who were able to liaise between the peasant class and between either the ruling Ottomans or later the British Mandate. They were the educated elite. They were the bureaucrats. They were the journalists. They were the teachers. They were all of these things. And after the Nakba, the notables lost everything that gave them a source of power in the first place. If it was their wealth was gone because they were separated from their land. If it was their prestige or their claim that they would defend the nation of Palestine and the Palestinian people, well, in that case, they had failed. Or at least this is what the people who had become displaced had judged upon them. That they failed to confront British colonialism and they failed to halt the Zionist project. Now, whether that is fair or not is actually completely besides the point. The point is that the notables from 1948 to this present day no longer play a major role in Palestinian life. Palestinians would need to look to other people beyond lineage, beyond family ties, beyond economic prestige and prowess and things, beyond all of those things for leadership. The next thing that you need to understand as I begin this chapter is that the Palestinian people were completely stunned by what had befallen them. And I've spoken to survivors of the Nakba, and many people here have, whether it's my own grandparents or other people's grandparents. And when the Palestinians first left in 1948, those who left believing that they were coming back, those who were leaving with bombs dropping upon their cities or a rifle to their head. For the Palestinians who left, they expected to come back. And for a brief, fuzzy period between the late summer of 1948 and the early days of 1949, many Palestinians could actually sneak back into Palestine from Lebanon and from Syria and other places. They could sneak back in and go into their homes and collect some of their belongings, harvest their crops. If they had a rifle or if they had some gold or something like that, they could go back into their homes. And about 6 or 7 months after the expulsion of the Palestinians, after the finality of the expulsion of the Palestinians, the now emergent state of Israel began to really harden its borders. Within 6 or 7 months, young Palestinian boys, 16, 17 years old, who were sneaking into Palestine were getting killed by sniper fire, and now suddenly the displacement felt more permanent. There was a realization that this is serious. Of course, they knew it was serious because of what had happened in the Nakba, but the impermanence of it began to feel much more permanent. You also have in this chapter a proliferation of the Palestinian story. The Palestinians who have now been expelled and have been displaced are in a position to tell their story not just to the non-Palestinian Arabs, but to tell the story of what befell them to each other. The first lecture that I gave, I spoke about the Bedouins of Palestine, I spoke about the peasants of Palestine, I spoke about urban Palestinians, I've spoken about the notables, and now suddenly the peasant and the Bedouin and the urban notable and the urban rich and the urban poor all find themselves together in refugee camps, all kind of looking at each other wondering, what happened? But the biggest theme of this chapter is that Palestinian resistance groups and Palestinian refugees become a factor in the domestic politics of the neighboring countries. Prior to 1948, the Palestinian cause is something that the neighboring countries look at from afar and decide to intervene or not intervene based on some other internal principles of theirs. Whether they believe that they should be helping their Muslim brothers and sisters, whether they believe they should be helping their Arab brothers and sisters. This came down to something that they were observing with distance. But now the Palestinian refugees are in their borders. So the Palestinians grow to play a significant part in the domestic politics of these countries. And the first place that we will look, and this is going to be the theme of this entire lecture, we will go from country to country seeing how these domestic politics impacted the Palestinian cause and how the Palestinians impacted domestic politics. We will begin with Egypt. And we begin with Egypt because it is at this time, just 4 years after the Nakba, that one of 3 seismic global events take place as it relates to the Palestinian issue. The first event in 1952 is that a group of military officers in Egypt overthrow the Egyptian monarch and create an Egyptian republic led by, eventually it comes to be led by, Jamal Abdel Nasser. And he becomes the face of an Egyptian-led pan-Arabism. I'm not going to spend a ton of time speaking about this week because it's going to be a huge part of the story next week. But I will say this. In the 1920s and 30s, what's called the interwar period, if you were to have placed a bet to say who is going to lead the Arab world, what nation would lead the Arab world, in my reading of history, it did not look clear at all that it was going to be Egypt. If anything, the country that looked most poised to lead the Arab world in a united struggle against colonialism would have been Iraq. That would have been the leading contender. And even in the 1950s, Abdul Karim Qasim, the leader of Iraq at exactly this time, was contesting leadership of the Arab world. To really summarize this, of why it came to pass that Egypt maintained its position throughout this period in the 20th century and Iraq did not, one explanation would be stability. Jamal Abdel Nasser maintained his rule, his essentially one-man rule of Egypt from this period until his death in 1970. Abdul Karim Qasim came to rule Iraq after several coups had already happened, and there were also several coups after his death. So Iraq ended up being less stable, and instability created by the British. That's another story. Perhaps I will get into that next week. But you have an Egyptian-led pan-Arabism. The second part of this, I said Egyptian-led, the second part is pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism was an ideology focused or dedicated to the unification of the Arabic-speaking world. From before the time of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire were looking for a mechanism to maintain the unity of the empire and later to maintain the unity of the fragments of the empire. Now, really what it came down to, when you look at something like pan-Islam or pan-Arabism, because these were really the two of the major contesting ideologies, the major question became, who is the us and who is the other? If you say that what unites us is that we are Muslims, then that makes your internal Christian minorities the other. Okay? On the other hand, if you say the Arab is the us, this is inclusive to the Christians, right? And in Egypt there is a significant Christian population. In Iraq there is a significant Christian population. In Lebanon, in Syria, in Palestine, there are significant Christian populations. So it seems more inclusive, right? Right? Not if you're a Kurd, not if you're an Amazigh, not if you're a Turkmen, not if you're any of these non-Arab minorities that exist in what we call the Arab world. So there was no easy fix to the various problems of the political projects were trying to solve problems of cohesion, and there were no easy solutions to this. All right. So the first major event is the free officer coup. The next major event is the Algerian War of Independence. And the Algerian War of Independence was a bloody affair. I mean, we were talking about upwards of 1 million Algerians giving their lives to free themselves of French rule. But the reason why it's noteworthy here is because it succeeded. And because they were successful, it gave the Palestinians watching this substantial moment in history, it gave them the sense that history can be overturned. The French are more powerful than Israel in their imagination. Right? The French are more powerful and were more deeply entrenched in Algeria than the Zionists were in Palestine. The Zionists arrived the other day. The French have been there for over 100 years and have been working on this project for a very long time. And yet the Algerians managed to grind the French away. Not through direct military confrontation, but through the war of the flea, right? The war that goes through hard-fought, gritty, asymmetrical warfare for 6 years. And the next bit of context you have to keep in mind is the Cold War. The Second World War has ended, and we are now in a bipolar world where the United States and the Soviet Union are the two remaining superpowers. All right. As I mentioned, the Palestinians, especially between that first decade after the Nakba, from 1948 to 1958, are in a stunned silence. And I don't mean a stunned silence on the individual level. I mean as a collective. There isn't a ton of intellectual activity being produced. There isn't a ton of resistance activity that we can really point to on an organized level, the likes of which we saw in 1936, the likes of which that we saw in 1948. The society has been shattered. You understand? Shattered. Your notable class that once led you are now nowhere to be seen. They have dissolved. Right? And their power has gone with them. The peasants who held their land for millennia are now wasting away in refugee camps. And 1 year becomes 2 years, becomes 5 years. But something does change for the Palestinians. The Palestinians who do end up in the camps, and the vast majority of the Palestinians who end up in the camps, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and elsewhere, the vast majority were formerly peasants, not urban people. For the most part, the vast majority are peasants, but that's because the vast majority of Palestinians were peasants. So of course that makes sense. And then the refugee camps are managed by the United Nations Relief Work Agency known as UNRWA. And UNRWA began to function almost like a state actor for Palestinians, providing every service that you can imagine except sovereignty, right? Except actual political sovereignty, except self-determination. Nothing like that, but in terms of medical services, it's being provided by UNRWA. Infrastructural services are being provided by UNRWA. And most importantly, educational services are being provided by UNRWA. Schools are built in every refugee camp. And now the Palestinians, who have no farms to work on, who have no jobs to go to, who have no investments to bank on, have nothing to do but learn. Their children have nothing but time. And so, you have a place like Gaza, which going into 1948 had a literacy rate of something like 10%. And overnight, the literacy rate within a generation for boys and girls skyrockets to something like 90%, which is incredible. And this is what I want to identify as kind of the first mode of resistance. You see, for the teachers who are working at these schools, and their first-hand accounts still exist because this is the 1950s, it really wasn't that long ago, there weren't that many qualified teachers. So basically, if you had an elementary education, you could qualify as a teacher. My grandmother was asked to be a teacher at an UNRWA school, and she only had a grade 5 or grade 6 education, but she was literate. So because she was literate, she was considered qualified to teach at a school, and now suddenly everyone who can teach is teaching, and everyone who can go to school is going to school. It's a substantial transformation in an agrarian society, that all of a sudden you have this really, really high literacy rate among a people who just a very short while ago were an agrarian people with very limited access to education. The British essentially did not invest in Palestinian education. That's a story for another time. But the result of this is mixed. On the one hand, the result is that many Palestinians now are qualified for jobs that their parents would have never been qualified for. And they begin to leave Palestine to go to places like emerging oil hubs of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Of course, they need to feed their families. And so once again, although you have this boost in education, you have this exodus of nearly everyone who is literate, educated, qualified for leadership. It's very difficult to build a resistance campaign when all of your best and brightest are leaving. And they're leaving the camps. They're leaving these new refugee camps. But what you do end up with is prominence on campuses across the Arab world. And so, some of these Palestinians who found themselves as refugees and were pursuing a higher level of education began to collect and began to organize in Egypt. And among them was a young Yasser Arafat, who in 1959, along with Khalil al-Wazir and Salah Khalaf, formed an organization, the acronym of which is, well, the reverse acronym, refers to the full official name, the Palestinian National Liberation Front, better known as Fatah, which also means conquest. The Arafat crew were not the only people getting organized at that time, but as the story progresses, you'll understand why they rose to prominence. Now, while this is happening in Egypt, eventually, with the end of the Algerian War of Independence, Algeria gives an official base to this Fatah organization. It gives them a place to operate from. But while this is happening, inside Palestine, specifically inside Gaza, there are sporadic groups. I say sporadic in terms of their not so consistent activity and the fact that they are not united in any single organization. There are groups of people who the locals call fidaiyin, sacrificers, who launch attacks beyond Gaza's borders into what is now the state of Israel. And sometimes they attack soldiers, sometimes they attack the people living in the homes that they used to live in just a few years ago, and sometimes they go in just to take things like their sheep. A lot of these incursions outside of Gaza into what was beyond the Green Line, they were just retrieving their livestock and their property. The problem with this for the Egyptian state is that when the reprisal would come, I guess I didn't explain this in a lot of detail, Gaza was under Egyptian administrative control immediately after 1948. So when this would happen, and a few Israelis would die, or many Israelis would die, or one Israeli would die, it doesn't really matter, the Israeli military would launch an overwhelming response in Gaza, often targeted at Egyptian soldiers. So the Egyptian government did not love the idea of these Palestinians engaging in this activity outside of their control. And so, in order to better control these emerging groups of Palestinians, the Arab League, led by Jamal Abdel Nasser, signs into existence the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the Palestine Liberation Organization, better known by its acronym, the PLO. And with that, they also create an armed group tacked to the PLO called the Palestine Liberation Army. And for Fatah, this newly emergent group, this presents a problem. You see, as soon as the PLO is created, you think about this. If you're a young Palestinian, you're 17 or 18 years old, the year is 1964, Jamal Abdel Nasser's portrait is in every home across the Arab world. He is the Imran Khan of his time. He is the Erdogan of his time. Right? Take that with a grain of salt. But anyways, to kind of give you an idea of the hype around Jamal Abdel Nasser, the belief is he is going to unite the Arab world, and suddenly he's created this organization, and you have this little scrappy startup, Fatah. Which one do you think is more recruitable? Which one do you think is more interesting and enticing for young Palestinian fighters? Certainly it is the PLO. So this new group, Fatah, feels like it has to do something or it's going to fade into obscurity. And so what they decide in late 1964 is that they are going to start directly attacking Israeli soldiers and infrastructure in an organized way. And their first operation is, if you look it up, it's called the Beit Nutafa canal bombing. They were bombing some water pipeline or something like that. And it was a disaster. Tactically speaking, on an organizational level, the whole thing was very amateur. It really reflects their inexperience at that time. The bomb that they set, the delay on it was so long that it was discovered by the Israelis before it had a chance to detonate. But that did not stop Fatah from going around writing about the heroism of trying to attack the Israelis. That they were not waiting for the Arab armies to liberate them, they would liberate themselves. Now on that point, I have to stop here for a minute because it's important. In the vision of Jamal Abdel Nasser, or at least his stated vision, we need to unite the Arab world and then we can liberate Palestine. Okay? And in the vision of some of these emergent groups, they would say that the thing that stands between us and unity is imperialism and the Zionist project. So liberate Palestine first and then unite the Arab world. So the question is, it's a chicken and egg political question. Which one goes first? So Fatah is saying liberation of Palestine comes first. Then the unity of the Arab world, a much grander project, comes second. This activity begins to raise the stock of this organization. And then, just a few years later, an absolutely seismic event takes place. Because I am doing the story of Palestinian resistance and not a political history of the Middle East, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. What I am going to say is this. In the summer of 1967, Israel launched a surprise attack against the Egyptians after weeks of jockeying and positioning and increasing tensions. Israel launches the surprise attack and absolutely flatlines Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It is completely devastating. It knocks the wind out of pan-Arabism. The whole Arab world is stunned again. 2 decades after the Nakba, you now have, at the moment of the Nakba, in 1948, or when the Nakba was over, when an armistice was signed, 78% of Palestine was lost. What remained was 22%, being the West Bank under Jordanian administrative control, and Gaza being under Egyptian administrative control. Now Israel came to control 100% of historic Palestine, and the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. For Israel, the victory of 1967 was an intoxicating, euphoric moment that remained for decades. The invincibility, the high of trampling through all of these armies was even beyond their wildest expectations. And for as euphoric and amazing as that was for Israel, it was precisely that devastating for the Arabs. But for those involved in resistance, it actually provided an opportunity. Imagine the picture between 1948 and 1967. Gaza is under Egyptian administrative control. So that means the people in Gaza for 20 years cannot travel into Haifa, they cannot go to Safad, they can't even communicate with the Arab who have remained there. The people under Jordanian administrative control are separated from Gaza and are separated from Al-Jalil, from Haifa, and from these places. But now it's all under Israeli administrative control. And suddenly, these Palestinians who have not seen each other in 20 years can, I don't want to say move freely, because up until 1967, the Arabs inside the Green Line were under military control. And then later, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip became under military control. But they could move more freely than they could the year before inside historic Palestine. The ones outside of Palestine, they're still out of luck. If you're in the camps of Lebanon, if you're in the camps of Syria, if you're in the camps of now Jordan in the east side of the Jordan River, you're out of luck. You're not communicating with the rest of the Palestinian community. But inside Palestine, they're able to communicate and organize in a way that they could not in the years prior. And for Fatah and the like of Fatah, for the organizations that are similar to it, they now are no longer competing with Pan-Arabism. They're not competing with, in terms of the Palestinian people themselves. And if you are Yasser Arafat at this time, and you're competing for the affection of the Palestinian people, and most of the affection is actually directed toward Jamal Abdel Nasser and his vision of Pan-Arabism, you now no longer are competing with that because it's been decimated. Absolutely decimated. And so, our theater moves from Egypt to Jordan, because Jordan becomes the main base for Palestinian activity. And in fact, from this point on, for the rest of this chapter, between 1948 and 1987, most of the most spectacular activities of resistance happen outside of Palestine's borders, or rather, they are planned outside of Palestine's borders. And Jordan becomes the main base of operation. Now, from the beginning, there is a tense relationship between the monarchy, the Jordanian monarchy, and its Palestinian majority. Let me repeat that. The Palestinians, since 1948, have made up a majority of Jordan's inhabitants. It's very difficult to build a cohesive society when more than half your population believes that they are from somewhere else. What complicates matters further is that the Jordanian monarch believes that he owns that place. Jordan, at this point, is laying claim of sovereignty to Al-Quds and to the West Bank. What complicates matters further is that the Jordanian monarchy has very close relationships with the West in general, particularly the British, and the origins of the Jordanian monarchy, or the British involvement in the origins of the Jordanian monarchy trace back to the First World War. It's a story beyond what I want to say right now. But the point is that from the very moment that the Palestinians arrive in such massive numbers, already the tension between these highly educated, highly motivated Palestinians and the Jordanian monarchy, comprised of the backbone being a Bedouin army, the tensions are inevitable. In 1967, Fatah joins the PLO and comes to lead the PLO. So you can see now Jamal Abdel Nasser knocked out of the picture. The PLO and Fatah become one and the same. And not literally one and the same, because there are other organizations inside the PLO, but Fatah becomes the dominant organization inside the PLO. And now, from their bases in Jordan, they begin launching attacks into the state of Israel. I'm going to make a brief segue here, just because there's a very interesting story that I didn't know how else to fit in, so I'll just fit in here. By this point, the secular character of this particular branch of Palestinian resistance is really starting to take shape. A significant contingent within the Palestinian resistance factions inside the PLO are not Muslims. Like another major faction who I don't really mention here yet, I'm going to mention them in a few slides, is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by George Habash. In case you haven't connected the dots from the name, he's a Christian. And so there is a significant portion for whom either they are not Muslims or who see the future of Palestine in primarily nationalist lens. And this was not to everyone's liking. So there was a young sheikh from Tulkarem who at this time went to go join the fighters of the PLO in their camps in Jordan, and he didn't particularly love the secular nature of the PLO fighters. And so he abandoned that and completed his Sharia education and then became a teacher in Saudi Arabia. Until 1979, when another global event happens, and that is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and he decides to go and join that. And his name was Abdullah Yusuf Azzam. Now, if you don't know who that is, he plays a very important role in what emerged as the jihad in Afghanistan. So he was a Palestinian. And he became the architect for the Arab fighters to come into Afghanistan to participate in that jihad. Total side story, I just found it interesting and worth sharing. The biggest boost to this branch of Palestinian resistance came in 1968. Just a year after the biggest setback, after one of the biggest catastrophes in the history of Islam, like on par with losing Al-Quds to the Crusaders. This is what happened in 1967, right? To lose Al-Quds to the Zionists was on par with any catastrophe you can imagine in the history of Islam. And 1 year later, these Palestinian fighters engage in a head-on clash with Israeli forces in the area known as Al-Karamat in Jordan. Now, Karamat in Arabic also means dignity. So the Battle of Karamat, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's, in terms of political theater, this writes itself. You have a battle in a place that literally means dignity. So in Arabic, it is the battle for dignity and it is the battle of dignity. And the Israelis end up losing something like 25 soldiers. The PLO will lose many more. But the fact that they were able to sustain themselves in battle against this invincible army where the Arab armies had withered away was the greatest marketing tool you can imagine. The Jordanian army at kind of the 11th hour ends up joining the Battle of Karamat as well. And there is an incredible moment, you could find it on YouTube, where a soldier named Khadr Shukri Yaqub finds himself completely surrounded, and he's separated from his unit, and he's completely surrounded by Israeli soldiers and by Israeli tanks. And he radios in to his command, and he says, Al-Hadaf Mawqi, like the goal that you're looking for, because they don't know where the Israelis are. The battlefield is very confusing. So he says, the goal is my position. And then he says, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah, irmi, which means launch your artillery at me. So my position is where they're all gathered. Launch your artillery at me, and you will get them. And he's martyred in this battle. He calls for an artillery strike on himself to destroy the Israeli position. The mythology of this event is enormous. And after that, this branch of Palestinian resistance realizes that the noteworthy and the spectacular are good for its recruitment efforts and are good for putting the Palestinian plight on the map. The communist branch of the PLO is an organization called the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and they were Marxist-Leninists. And they become infamous for airplane hijackings. And they use these airplane hijackings for ransoms, they use these airplane hijackings to do prisoner exchanges. Probably the most famous photo of this entire period in Palestinian history, this whole period from 1948 to 1987, if you wanted two of the most famous photos you'll ever see of this period, one is a young Layla Khaled, a woman with a kufiya as a hijab, essentially, carrying an AK-47. If you don't know who she is, you've probably seen the photo at some point in your life, because it's very famous. And another are two, I think they were Delta airplanes on a Jordanian runway being detonated and exploded. And the question really becomes at this point, can these non-state actors do what the Arab armies failed to do? The problem is that while all of this is happening, the PLO is essentially creating, and I'm going to put my Jordanian monarch hat on for a moment, the PLO is essentially creating in Jordan a state within a state. And just like how when the Fidaiyin were attacking from inside Gaza and the reprisal was hitting the Egyptian military, so too were the reprisals to Jordanian-based attacks landing upon the heads of the Jordanian military. And these things are happening, of course, without the knowledge of, or permission of, or coordination with the Jordanian monarch. The PFLP, Fatah, all of these other organizations, they are not communicating with King Hussein, saying, hey, we're planning on engaging this attack, for the obvious reason that they did not trust him, with really, really good justification for that, but they didn't. And so, after the Dawson Field hijacking, which resulted in the destruction of those two airplanes, a really spectacular event, but a very humiliating experience for the Jordanian monarch, the Jordanian military in September of 1970 goes on the offensive against the PLO. And the PLO makes the mistake of trying to confront the Jordanian army as an army. In later decades, survivors of this war, those who participated in the fighting, later said, we should have allowed the Jordanian army to come into the camps. Like what they were trying to do was face the Jordanian army head on, symmetrical warfare. So instead, we should have drawn them into the camps and we should have fought them there. But they didn't. And with American support and with Syrian support, the PLO was defeated. And in an agreement arranged with the Arab League, the PLO, battered and bruised, but not annihilated, moves their center of operation from Jordan to Lebanon. And that is where we go to next. Now, Jordan's border with Palestine is enormous. Lebanon's border with Palestine is not nearly as big. And so it's easier to contain. So in the calculation of resistance versus the Zionists, this was a win for the Zionists. To have the PLO move from Jordan to Lebanon was definitely a win. But in Lebanon, resistance also moves into another gear. I spent a whole hour in the first session describing to you how in the Ottoman era, the Palestinians did not have the infrastructure for high-level military training. If you were here in the first session, do you remember this? Right? We spent a long time talking about that. By the 1970s, the Palestinians are training every paramilitary organization on earth. The IRA, FARC, ETA, whoever, like all of these, they're not even related to the Middle East in any way. They are being trained in PLO camps in Lebanon. And really, everyone who was kind of like a thrill seeker was suddenly coming into Lebanon to come hang out with the PLO and, play revolutionary. And this will really give you a sense. This next part should give you a sense of how impactful to this very day, how impactful the presence of the PLO in Lebanon actually was. One of the people that came through these PLO training camps and became an elite, bodyguard slash, I'm trying to think of like the technical term for his position in Fatah, but he became one of Fatah's elite fighters, was a Lebanese young man named Ahmad Mughniya. Ahmad Mughniya was a close confidant of Yasser Arafat. He became one of his bodyguards. He becomes one of the elite fighters to come through these camps. Very sharp, very intelligent. He does have a falling out with the PLO for what he perceives as their pro-Saddam politics at a time where he felt that his co-religionists, he was a Shia Lebanese, and he felt that his co-religionists in Iraq were being persecuted by Saddam, and he did not particularly appreciate this, but he doesn't officially break with Fatah at any particular point until some later events that I'm going to mention later, but he does end up forming his own organization called Jihad al-Islamiyya, the Islamic Jihad in Lebanon. And Jihad al-Islamiyya eventually merges with a bunch of other militias in Lebanon to form an organization called Hezbollah. And so, in a sense, Hezbollah can trace its origins, and its tactical origins at least, its military training, to the time of Ahmad Mughniya and his colleagues in these PLO camps. A perhaps even more remarkable story. Again, I'm trying to tell you the story of Palestinian resistance. An even more remarkable story is narrated by the late journalist slash historian Robert Fisk. And he says, in 1978, please pay attention to the year. He says, in 1978, he visited a PLO camp, and he was used to seeing people in black and white kufiyas, but he found a man in a solid black kufiya. So he asked some of the PLO fighters, can I talk to him? And they said, you can try to talk to him if you want, but he doesn't speak Arabic. And they said, does he speak English? He said, yeah, he speaks English, go and talk to him. So Robert Fisk goes and talks to him, and he asks him, where are you from? Like they said, you don't speak Arabic. And he says, I speak Farsi, and I am with the Iranian opposition, and our goal is to overthrow the Shah. Now when Robert Fisk leaves, him and his friend are laughing and saying, what an idiot this guy is. He thinks he's going to overthrow the most deeply entrenched regime in maybe all of Asia, like the most stable monarch in the broader Middle East. What a doofus. And a year later, that's exactly what they did. And so you had the Iranian opposition also coming through these PLO training camps. Now, Lebanon is full of refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps. And at this time, the experience of the refugee camps in Lebanon are not all that dissimilar from the experience of the refugee camps in Jordan and inside Palestine. And so from the camps in Lebanon emerges, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this for anyone who's interested in it, I did a whole podcast series on this, emerges a genre of resistance music. And that becomes a way of essentially educating the masses about the history of Palestine. And this proliferates all over the Arab world. But also now you have Palestinian radio stations emerging from these positions as well. And you have more spectacular militancy. It is in this period that a group known as the Black September Organization take a bunch of Israeli athletes hostage in Munich in 1972. But I said from the onset, the Palestinians have now become a factor in the domestic politics of their various host countries. Lebanon, I will quote my favorite historian, Michael Provence, here when he says, in 1920, the French invented Lebanon. Okay. Lebanon historically was a part of Greater Syria. And to the extent that there was a Lebanese identity at all, it really was confined to Mount Lebanon's Christians. Very few Muslim people in the region surrounding Mount Lebanon would have referred to themselves as Lebanese. Who is the most famous poet in the English language? Shakespeare. Who's the second most famous poet in the English language? Yeah, Khalil Gibran. Khalil Gibran is the second most quoted, printed, cited, famous poet in the English language. Khalil Gibran is a Lebanese hero, right? Like, there are statues of him all over the place and things named after him. In his own writings, Khalil Gibran refers to himself as Syrian. He never calls himself Lebanese. Okay? So it gives you an idea, right? I know we can project our biases upon the past all we like, but this is the reality. But once it was created, a national identity eventually began to emerge. Today, decades later, I guess, but with the presence of Palestinians in Lebanon, a very delicate demographic balance was disrupted. The French created Lebanon with the intention of preserving a Christian majority, or at least a dominant Christian minority. Now you have tens of thousands of overwhelmingly Sunni Palestinians coming into a place that is very, very, very unstable, created in a manner that was unstable. And so in 1975, 1976, there was a podcast I was listening to recently, and the historian was Lebanese, and he says, he referred to the Palestinians as the ignition switch, or the trigger for the civil war. Some factions within Lebanon wanted to blame the Palestinians for the civil war, and he says, well, first of all, the civil war continued for like another 20 years after the Palestinians weren't even a variable anymore. But he says the powder keg was already built, but the Palestinian presence was the ignition switch. A civil war breaks out in 1975 and 1976. Essentially between, and I'm being simplistic, but essentially between pro-Palestinian Lebanese factions led by the Palestinians themselves and anti-Palestinian Lebanese factions led by Maronite Christians. These are essentially the fault lines of the Lebanese Civil War. Huge simplification, because there were Maronite Christians who were pro-Palestinian. And so the war was very, very messy. the war is hot and cold until the 90s. But all the while, an Israeli general named Ariel Sharon becomes the commander for Israeli forces in the north of Palestine, right, along the southern Lebanese border. And he continues to agitate for an invasion of southern Lebanon, which he finally manages to achieve in 1982. And in 1982, Beirut is surrounded by Israeli forces. But the Israelis are not able to actually take the city. And herein lies, and I'll end here, herein lies what I think is the single greatest strategic failure in the history of Palestinian resistance. The PLO agrees, in order to end the Israeli invasion, the PLO agrees essentially to disarm and to go into exile in Tunisia, آخر الدنيا, the other end of the world. The PLO is promised by the Israelis and by the United Nations that if they disarm and they withdraw, that the Palestinians will be protected by international forces. Very shortly after the Palestinians leave, the massacre of Sabra and Shatila in the camps of Lebanon takes place. No such protection is ever allotted to the Palestinians in Lebanon. They are sitting ducks. I don't know precisely how the current war in Gaza will end. But I can tell you with zealous certainty how it will not end. It will not end with Hamas disarming and being exiled in Tunisia, because every Palestinian knows this story. This lesson is imprinted on an entire people. I say that this is the single greatest strategic failure because in 1948, the Palestinians had been decimated by the British through years of repression in the Great Revolt. They were not prepared to confront the Zionist project. In 1967, the showdown was with the Arab armies and with the State of Israel. In 1982, it would have cost, I believe it was Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister of Israel at that time. It was either Menachem Begin or Yitzhak Shamir. I believe it was Menachem Begin. And he took, his military were telling him to take Beirut, it was going to cost them 10,000 Israeli soldiers. Not that they would need a force of 10,000 Israeli soldiers. 10,000 soldiers would die taking Beirut. And he felt that the cost was too high. They were not prepared to pay that price. This was the single greatest strategic blunder in the history of the Palestinian people, as far as I am concerned. We could talk about it in the question and answer if you'd like, but this is a hill I'm willing to die on. And so, after that, for this particular stream of Palestinian resistance, both their willingness and their ability to continue engaging in armed resistance against the Israelis is limited. Suddenly, the more diplomatic elements within the Palestinian camp, within this particular Palestinian camp, begin to put out their feelers to see if maybe they could come to some kind of political resolution that does not require them to continue engaging in armed resistance. But that is where I'm going to end for now. I've put up a QR code here, and it does lead to a question bank. I guess that a lot of the questions will go to you. So I know every week so far I've been asking the sisters if they want to ask any questions, and either they don't have any questions or they prefer to not ask them. But the QR code is here. If you do want to ask any questions, you can. If any of the brothers are shy to ask questions, you can also use these QR codes. Otherwise, I am opening the floor to questions. You could raise your hand if you want, and I will let Dirar collect these questions in the meantime. Questions or concerns, feedback or remarks? Yes?
When America started helping the Palestinians in the camps, what is one thing that's right all the time? Why were America helping them with education and all this at the same time?
UNRWA, so the question was, why was America helping the Palestinians in the camps? It wasn't. The United Nations Relief Work Agency was helping the Palestinians in the camps. And if you're thinking, what is the strategic wisdom of that? Why would they do that? The best description that I've heard of UNRWA is, it is like a shot of morphine for the Palestinian people. Without UNRWA, the Palestinian people would have starved to death. Okay? Because they are non-citizens, they are displaced peoples. A solution to their problem would have needed to arrive sooner. And that solution may have either been liberation or death. Okay? But with UNRWA, this pitiful existence could persist for decades. Okay? حال التخدير. Just keep moving them along, one generation after another, after another, after another. You'd be amazed how long you could survive just on Band-Aids. Just on, Tylenol Band-Aids, right? And this was UNRWA. So it did serve a strategic purpose in that so long as their bellies were, I don't want to say full, so long as their bellies were not empty, they could survive for one more generation. Other questions? Yes, sir. Come to you next. Right.
That is not probably honored.
So, the brother's actually just adding to the point that I was making, which is that with UNRWA came a permanence to these camps. Okay? All of the other refugee camps around the world are really thought of as very much temporary. In the case of UNRWA camps, there was a sense of permanence to their instability. You had your hand up, go ahead. Can you ask that again? Did the Egyptian Republic? So the question is, did the Egyptian Republic help the Palestinians more after the British left? Implied in the question is that the Egyptian monarchy was helpful. Right? Because to help more, it would mean that there was some base level of help to begin with. You would have a hard time. I'm trying to answer this as generously as I can. If you were to sit here, or if I were to sit here and say that the Egyptian Republic was truly, in any meaningful sense, ever dedicated to the project of Palestinian liberation, ever, I would have a really hard time making that case. And the reason why this is so sensitive, the reason why I'm trying to be generous and kind, is because in 1967 and in 1973, thousands of Egyptian soldiers died for exactly that cause. That there were Egyptian soldiers going to the front lines with the intention and the expectation that they were liberating Palestine. Okay? So on the one hand, yeah, I think there were millions of Egyptians, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, who were zealously committed to the project of Palestinian liberation. On the other hand, I don't think at a political or strategic level that Egypt ever really made this a top priority. Ever. Now, you will notice, and I had a slide on this and I deleted it, this is not entirely Egypt's fault. If you've been here since week 1, you'll notice that our story evolved from an Ottoman story to an Arab story to a Palestinian story. And that is the brilliance of colonialism. Egypt also has its own problems. And its problems are staggering. Like the number of mouths to feed is a huge, huge project for Egypt. Syria also had its own problems recovering from French imperialism. Lebanon also had its own problems dealing with its sectarian imbalance. Jordan also had its own problem in that its population was so sparse compared to its now massive Palestinian refugee population. All of these places have their own problems. Some of their problems are of their own creation. That is the brilliance of colonialism. But the question that you posed was essentially, were they ever sincere or meaningful in their effort for Palestinian liberation? I find that to be a very hard case to make. I think the case of, this is probably the kindest thing that I could say. I think Jamal Abdel Nasser was exactly as committed to Palestinian liberation as Recep Tayyip Erdogan is to Palestinian liberation. The Palestinian flag and the Palestinian people are a great rallying call. Right? Look at your oppressed brothers and sisters not that far from us. Vote for me because I speak on their behalf. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to change anything, right? But support me because occasionally I will say something in the United Nations. Occasionally I will say something at the Arab League, and it has served them well. But did they pull their weight in response? I'd have a really hard time making that case with a serious face. Any other questions? And Dirad, do we have questions on the other side? I don't know where the question bank goes, so I'm leaving that up to you. Yes, sir.
So, like, you wrote from 1948 or 1975.
Yes,
You skipped the 1973 war.
I did.
Yeah, like, you know, all that. And you didn't mention also the invasion of Sinai, but that's kind of the Iraq of 1967.
Right. I didn't mention it because I'm trying to hyper-focus on the story of Palestinian resistance. This was, of all of the weeks that I put together, this one was the hardest. Because the number of moving parts, the number of events that happened between 1948 and 1987 are huge. But I'm trying to just focus on the evolution of Palestinian resistance. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I eventually want to be able to get all of us to the war that we're watching today. And I'm trying to connect those dots. So in doing so, I've missed huge global events, the biggest one being the 1973 war. Now, one of the reasons why I didn't mention that, but I mentioned some of the others, is because the Palestinian involvement in that war was minimal. Very, very minimal in that particular theater. Let me just read the question first. This is a great question, somewhat outside of the scope of today, but it's a very good question. So the question is, I'll actually read it in full. How big do you think Iran's role is in potentially liberating Palestine? If not, who do you think could liberate Palestine in the near future? Related to what you mentioned about the Iranian opposition coming through the PLO, was that during the time of the Iranian Revolution? How intertwined is the history between Iran and Palestine in terms of the revolution? Okay, so let's deal with the first question first. The Syrian Revolution was not that long ago, right? Like we gathered in this musalla when our brothers and sisters who have now been part of this community for over 10 years, when these Syrian refugees first started coming here. And Iran's role in the repression of the Syrian revolution was severe. And that cannot be forgotten. I will say this. My whole life, my whole adult life, has been defined by the war on terror. Okay? My whole adult life has been defined by this. And the war on terror is really itself a project that involved, or that required, rabid Islamophobia, hyper-venomous Islamophobia, American hegemonic dominance and acquiescence to that dominance, trust in government, and unprecedented levels of sectarian violence in the Muslim world. Okay? All of those things were necessary for the war on terror to succeed and to continue. And every single one of those things right now is falling apart. American hegemonic dominance, you have BRICS countries, you have Russia and China who are willing to, I'm not fans of these countries, I'm just telling you, as far as American hegemonic dominance is concerned, the likes of which that we saw in 1991, the likes of which that we saw in 2003, is fading. Okay? America is being reduced from a hyperpower in a unipolar world to a superpower in a multipolar world. In terms of the rabid Islamophobia that we saw, it is insane for me to imagine, I can't believe I'm seeing in my lifetime, that 50% of young Americans have a more favorable view of Hamas than the state of Israel. Not of the Palestinians, but of Hamas, which is a seismic cultural shift. But I want to focus on the sectarianism that raged through the Muslim world from after the American invasion of Iraq. Unlike Israel, which is an implanted settler colony that has been suffering from a condition of graft versus host from its very inception, a region has been rejecting it. The fact of the matter is, Iran is an organic and indigenous part of the region. Iran is not an implant. It is part of the region. And so, one way or another, we are going to have to learn to live with their presence. I don't know how to make it more clear than that. It's not going anywhere, right? It is not a settler colony. It is not a nation made up of people with dual citizenships. It's a country that's there to stay as your neighbor. So you're going to have to figure it out in some way or another. However, I do not believe that anyone is coming to the rescue of the Palestinians. Jamal Abdel Nasser is not coming. Saddam is not coming. Imran Khan is not coming. Erdogan is not coming. Nobody's coming to save us. It's just a reality. And that is why, and what I'm saying is not, I don't think is a unique position among the Palestinian people. And that is why, in the last editions of this story, you're going to see that the Palestinians coming to this realization figured, we're going to have to do this on our own. And I have to say, I'm very impressed with the results. As for the second part of the question, yes, the presence of the Iranian opposition in PLO camps was right before the Iranian Revolution. I don't want to exaggerate the role of their time in PLO camps, but there was a connection there. And there is a folk tale, I don't know if it's true or not, it's probably not true, but the Iranians were quite enthusiastic about spreading the story themselves. They said there were only 2 times when Imam Khomeini ever smiled. The first was when he stepped foot in Iran after having been exiled, and the second was when he met Yasser Arafat. For the Iranians, the Palestinian struggle has also been a part of their revolution and a part of their identity. I will just wrap up this point by saying one thing. And for all of the young adults here, I think this is good advice. Okay, so please listen carefully. I, as a private individual and as a Palestinian, I will take unconditional support from anybody. Anybody wants to write me a check and say, I support you and your cause and what you're doing. I want no involvement and no say in what you're doing, but here's a check. Barakallahu feek. Thank you. I will take unconditional support from anyone. And I will not take conditional support from anyone, ever. So if the Iranians are willing to provide unconditional support, ahla wa sahla. Provide everything that you want. They have an advantage in it, in that it boosts their image in the Sunni Muslim Arab world. And the advantage to the Palestinian factions is that they get access to resources and materials that they will not get from their own neighbors. If the support is unconditional, Habibi, take it any day of the week. Any other questions? I see now suddenly like, Hasnain, go ahead. I'll take two more questions, so this and one more. Yeah.
So you spoke about people at least on one side. On the other side, you spoke about the Algerian war of independence.
Yes.
So after the war of independence, the Algerians were free. Normally you get a sense that when the fighters are free, they go look for another war. So is there anything like that amongst the Algerians?
Of the Algerian fight. So the brother is asking, did the Algerians go and look for another war? I don't think anyone's ever looking for another war, but the Algerians refocused from a revolutionary experience to a state-building experience. Now, unfortunately, that state-building experience was marred with other catastrophes, leading to a very bloody civil war in the 90s, a truly, truly tragic outcome, which was also a learning lesson for the Palestinians. My friend who lives in Palestine now tells me one of the things that the Palestinians are very worried about. And they said throughout the early 2000s, as their ideologies have morphed and changed, is they're very fearful of ending up like the Algerians. They're very fearful of, after a liberated Palestine, to end up in a civil war situation. But did the Algerians find themselves in another war? They found themselves in every other war. Every other major jihad of the 20th century had droves of Algerians in it. Yes. Yeah. For better or for worse, or it's not my area of expertise, but a substantial contingent of Algerians. Yes. Yes. Last question. Go ahead. Well, you know what? Actually, I took a question. I'll let him, and then you can speak with me. But I want to let these nice people go sleep and pray Isha. Yes. Well, yeah. No problem. Right. So this is a major question to end us off with. So I'll say a few things. So the first thing that he mentioned was the realization of the Palestinians that they are alone, right? That they will not be saved by Arab armies and things like that. I will put one caveat here. You know, one of the mashayikh of Palestine was asked kind of like a pretty ridiculous question at some point in an earlier war. He was asked, هل لكم ملاجئ في غزة? Like, do you have shelters in Gaza? Do you have somewhere to hide when there's bombing? And he said, نعم نلجأ إلى الله عز وجل. Yeah, we have shelter. We seek shelter in Allah عز وجل. So the Palestinians are not alone. This is the first thing that I will say. And that realization, the realization that they could only depend on Allah, is actually the best possible realization of any people ever. Because in fact, this is actually the only true power. Having said that, the second part of your question was about, well, it was a two-parter. You mentioned how the Israelis kind of lifted themselves up, and why can't the Palestinians not only lift themselves up, but also pursue a diplomatic approach? Okay, so the first part, the idea that the Israelis lifted themselves up is farcical. Like, it is so, with all due respect, but it is so far removed from reality, I almost don't even know where to begin. There is, I know, but there is maybe no project in modern history that had more multipolar support from superpowers than this project. Like, the closest thing that I could think of is the Armenians in the 1920s, and even then, the support for the Zionist project dwarfs anything the Armenians ever got. This is the first thing. As for the support or pursuance of diplomatic approaches, it's not like the Palestinians never did that. I'm telling a story of Palestinian resistance. When the Palestinians began to pursue a diplomatic approach, okay, this is when Khalil al-Wazir was murdered, founder of Fatah. When they began to be more diplomatic, this is when the Israelis realized that they might actually have mainstream credibility. We need to begin killing them. We cannot allow them to live. In short, if the Palestinians, you're going to see this in the coming weeks, but I'll just skip ahead. If the Palestinians protest, the Israeli policy was break their bones. If the Palestinians come to the border of Gaza to protest and cheer, the Israeli policy is send in the snipers. If the Palestinians attack, the Israeli policy is the Dahiya doctrine of 2006 in Lebanon, right? Flatten entire cities, flatten entire camps. So you are not dealing with, you are dealing with an entity that believes that anything other than the complete subjugation of the Palestinians is an existential threat. Anything other than the Palestinians being essentially enslaved and acquiescing to the existence of the state of Israel, anything short of that for the Israelis is an existential threat that cannot exist. It is for that reason that when I was in university and we would bring in like Norman Finkelstein or John Elmer or some speaker to come and talk, the Israeli student organizations would bring in former soldiers to take notes. They were sponsored by the state. And their big concern was boycott and divestment and sanctions. So think about what I'm saying to you. Boycott, divestment, sanctions is an existential threat. Okay? Hamas is an existential threat. Protests are an existential threat. University encampments are an existential threat. The United Nations Security Council is an existential threat. The ICJ is an existential threat. This is the world that they have created. There is nothing that the Palestinians can do that the Israelis will ever be happy with other than complete and total submission. Nothing. But it's a great question to end with. So thank you for that. Barakallahu feekum wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. كانت النية إنه اليوم يكون أقصر يوم. يعني الله يعافيك. What time is عشاء؟
هلا
السلام.
مش تروح.
Just نقول لك يعطيك العافية.
الله يعافيك. الله يخليك.
I'm glad with the questions today.
They were very good questions.
The answers were